Live from the TV30 studio, here is Jim Schneider.
Well, hi and welcome to inFocus. Tonight's program we're entitling Political Shakeup, and as you watch the videos tonight, you're going to find out why. Just before we get to that, though, let me just mention that, Lord willing, next week we'll have our live inFocus program. Looking forward to having Daniel Degner with us from Wisconsin Family Council for a legislative update. We'll be talking about the importance of the April 1st election and so much more. So plan to join us at a brand new set for inFocus coming up, Lord willing, next Monday evening. Well, as I mentioned, Political Shakeup is underway here across not only our nation, but around the world as well. And one of the first speeches that was given was by our Vice President, J.D. Vance. He went to the Munich Security Conference and gave a speech there. And I'm looking at some of the headlines that came, such as from foreignpolicy.com, the speech that stunned Europe. A headline from Pamela Geller. J.D. Vance scorches European leaders in Munich. CNN called it a blistering speech. NPR called it that he's scorching the European allies. So what did he have to say that was so egregious? J.D. Vance warned about the enemy from within. We're going to let you see for yourself. Sit back and watch how he addressed this Munich Security Conference just recently.
Of the United States, Mr. J.D. Vance, who was here last year as senator, and we are very happy that he has come back to Munich, and we are very much looking forward to his speech. Please welcome Vice President J.D. Vance.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all the gathered delegates and luminaries and media professionals, and thanks especially to the host of the Munich Security Conference for being able to put on such an incredible event. We're, of course, thrilled to be here. We're happy to be here. And, you know, one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is, of course, our shared values. And, you know, it's great to be back in Germany. As you heard earlier, I was here last year as United States Senator. I saw Foreign Secretary David Lammy and joked that both of us last year had different jobs than we have now. But now it's time for all of our countries, for all of us who have been fortunate enough to be given political power by our respective peoples, to use it wisely to improve their lives. And I want to say that, you know, I was fortunate in my time here to spend some time outside the walls of this conference over the last 24 hours. And I've been so impressed by the hospitality of the people, even as, of course, as they're reeling from yesterday's horrendous attack. And the first time I was ever in Munich was with my wife, actually, who's here with me today, on a personal trip. And I've always loved the city of Munich, and I've always loved its people. And I just want to say that we're very moved, and our thoughts and prayers are with Munich and everybody affected by the evil inflicted on this beautiful community. We're thinking about you, we're praying for you, and we will certainly be rooting for you in the days and weeks to come. Now, I hope that's not the last bit of applause that I get, but we gather at this conference, of course, to discuss security. And normally, we mean threats to our external security. I see many great military leaders gathered here today. But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. He warned that if things don't go to plan, the very same thing could happen in Germany, too. Now, these cavalier statements are shocking to American ears. For years, we've been told that everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values. Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is billed as a defense of democracy. But when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I say ourselves because I fundamentally believe that we are on the same team. We must do more than talk about democratic values, we must live them. Now, within living memory of many of you in this room, the Cold War positioned defenders of democracy against much more tyrannical forces on this continent. And consider the side in that fight that censored dissidents, that closed churches, that canceled elections. Were they the good guys? Certainly not. And thank God they lost the Cold War. They lost because they neither valued nor respected all of the extraordinary blessings of liberty. The freedom to surprise, to make mistakes, to invent, to build. As it turns out, you can't mandate innovation or creativity, just as you can't force people what to think, what to feel, or what to believe. And we believe those things are certainly connected. And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat. And in the interest of comedy, my friends, but also in the interest of truth, I will admit that sometimes the loudest voices for censorship have come not from within Europe, but from within my own country, where the prior administration threatened and bullied social media companies to censor so-called misinformation. Misinformation like, for example, the idea that coronavirus had likely leaked from a laboratory in China. Our own government encouraged private companies to silence people who dared to utter what turned out to be an obvious truth. So I come here today not just with an observation, but with an offer. And just as the Biden administration seemed desperate to silence people for speaking their minds, so the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite, and I hope that we can work together on that. In Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer it in the public square, agree or disagree. Now, we're at the point, of course, that the situation has gotten so bad that this December, Romania straight up canceled the results of a presidential election based on the flimsy suspicions of an intelligence agency and enormous pressure from its continental neighbors. Now, as I understand it, the argument was that Russian disinformation had infected the Romanian elections. But I'd ask my European friends to have some perspective. You can believe it's wrong for Russia to buy social media advertisements to influence your elections. We certainly do. You can condemn it on the world stage even. But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with. Now, the good news is that I happen to think your democracies are substantially less brittle than many people apparently fear. And I really do believe that allowing our citizens to speak their mind will make them stronger still. Which, of course, brings us back to Munich, where the organizers of this very conference have banned lawmakers representing populist parties on both the left and the right from participating in these conversations. Now, again, we don't have to agree with everything or anything that people say. But when people represent, when political leaders represent an important constituency, it is incumbent upon us to at least participate in dialogue with them. Now, to many of us on the other side of the Atlantic, it looks more and more like old entrenched interests hiding behind ugly Soviet-era words like misinformation and disinformation, who simply don't like the idea that somebody with an alternative viewpoint might express a different opinion or, God forbid, vote a different way or, even worse, win an election. Now, this is a security conference, and I'm sure you all came here prepared to talk about how exactly you intend to increase defense spending over the next few years in line with some new target. And that's great, because as President Trump has made abundantly clear, he believes that our European friends must play a bigger role in the future of this continent. We don't think, you hear this term, burden sharing, but we think it's an important part of being in a shared alliance together that the Europeans step up while America focuses on areas of the world that are in great danger. But let me also ask you, how will you even begin to think through the kinds of budgeting questions if we don't know what it is that we're defending in the first place? I've heard a lot already in my conversations, and I've had many, many great conversations with many people gathered here in this room. I've heard a lot about what you need to defend yourselves from, and of course that's important. But what has seemed a little bit less clear to me, and certainly I think to many of the citizens of Europe, is what exactly it is that you're defending yourselves for. What is the positive vision that animates this shared security compact that we all believe is so important? And I believe deeply that there is no security if you are afraid of the voices, the opinions, and the conscience that guide your very own people. Europe faces many challenges, but the crisis this continent faces right now, the crisis I believe we all face together, is one of our own making. If you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you. Nor, for that matter, is there anything that you can do for the American people who elected me and elected President Trump. You need democratic mandates to accomplish anything of value in the coming years. Have we learned nothing that thin mandates produce unstable results? But there is so much of value that can be accomplished with the kind of democratic mandate that I think will come from being more responsive to the voices of your citizens. If you're going to enjoy competitive economies, if you're going to enjoy affordable energy and secure supply chains, Then you need mandates to govern, because you have to make difficult choices to enjoy all of these things. And of course, we know that very well in America. You cannot win a democratic mandate by censoring your opponents or putting them in jail, whether that's the leader of the opposition, a humble Christian praying in her own home, or a journalist trying to report the news. Nor can you win one by disregarding your basic electorate on questions like who gets to be a part of our shared society. And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. Today, almost 1 in 5 people living in this country moved here from abroad. That is, of course, an all-time high. It's a similar number, by the way, in the United States, also an all-time high. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course it's gotten much higher since. And we know this situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade. We saw the horrors wrought by these decisions yesterday in this very city. And of course, I can't bring it up again without thinking about the terrible victims who had a beautiful winter day in Munich ruined. Our thoughts and prayers are with them and will remain with them. But why did this happen in the first place? It's a terrible story, but it's one we've heard way too many times in Europe and unfortunately too many times in the United States as well. An asylum seeker, often a young man in his mid-20s, already known to police, rams a car into a crowd and shatters a community. How many times must we suffer these appalling setbacks before we change course and take our shared civilization in a new direction? No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants. But you know what they did vote for? In England, they voted for Brexit, and agree or disagree, they voted for it. And more all over Europe, they're voting for political leaders who promise to put an end to out-of-control migration. Now, I happen to agree with a lot of these concerns, but you don't have to agree with me. I just think that people care about their homes, they care about their dreams, they care about their safety and their capacity to provide for themselves and their children. And they're smart. I think this is one of the most important things I've learned in my brief time in politics. Contrary to what you might hear a couple mountains over in Davos, the citizens of all of our nations don't generally think of themselves as educated animals or as interchangeable cogs of a global economy. And it's hardly surprising that they don't want to be shuffled about or relentlessly ignored by their leaders. And it is the business of democracy to adjudicate these big questions at the ballot box. I believe that dismissing people, dismissing their concerns, or worse yet, shutting down media, shutting down elections, or shutting people out of the political process protects nothing. In fact, it is the most surefire way to destroy democracy. And speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential. And trust me, I say this with all humor, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. But what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being considered. Democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters. There's no room for firewalls. You either uphold the principle or you don't. Europeans, the people, have a voice. European leaders have a choice. And my strong belief is that we do not need to be afraid of the future. You can embrace what your people tell you, even when it's surprising, even when you don't agree. And if you do so, you can face the future with certainty and with confidence, knowing that the nation stands behind each of you. And that, to me, is the great magic of democracy. It's not in these stone buildings or beautiful hotels. It's not even in the great institutions that we have built together as a shared society. To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little. As Pope John Paul II, in my view, one of the most extraordinary champions of democracy on this continent or any other, once said, "Do not be afraid." We shouldn't be afraid of our people, even when they express views that disagree with their leadership. Thank you all. Good luck to all of you. God bless you.
A powerful address given by Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference that has the entire world talking about it right now. Well, very interesting there, as the Trump administration does mean business, and really as he addressed this group, warning them about the enemy within. And friends, you could hear the very light applause at different times, perhaps a courteous applause at times for him, but a message that needed to be heard. We've got some important issues coming up here. April 1st is our election, our spring election, voting on a Supreme Court justice, superintendent of public instruction, other issues, a constitutional amendment. We'll have more on that next week. But one of the areas that the Supreme Court is dealing with is the future of Act 10 in the state of Wisconsin. It's an act that has saved billions of dollars of your tax dollars here across the state. Well, the MacIver Institute has done just a superb job in telling the Act 10 story. You're not going to get this from other sources, but we're going to share it with you tonight here on inFocus. Let's watch.
In 1959, Wisconsin became the first state to allow government workers to unionize. Soon, all of them were union members. Union negotiators ran circles around local officials, demanding ever more extravagant contracts. Property taxes soared. Taxpayers demanded state lawmakers do something. Finally, they put revenue limits on school districts in 1994 and levy limits on counties and municipalities in 2006. But the unions did not let up, and local officials had no choice but to start cutting services. The state was also getting squeezed. 2 recessions in less than 10 years made it even worse. Democrats tried raising taxes, budget gimmicks, borrowing and refinancing, even illegal bookkeeping tricks. By the time Republicans swept the 2010 election and Scott Walker came into office, Wisconsin was facing a $3.5 billion budget deficit, and it was out of options, save one. Wisconsin was flat broke when Governor Jim Doyle left office, and Governor Walker's team immediately got to work picking up the pieces.
The Doyle administration, going back to the beginning, had used every trick and gimmick that was available to try and make it appear as though we had a balanced budget. We were simply out of those tricks, and the governor wouldn't do those anyway.
We aren't going to raise taxes. We aren't going to increase fees. There's only one other way to do that, and that's to rein in spending.
And there was no way to rein in spending while the unions were still calling the shots. The contracts had gotten completely out of control.
Individuals getting paid if they carried a pager, more money. Or individuals if they had a cell phone, getting more money. Or pay on the weekends if you get a phone call from your boss asking you where a file was, you got to clock in. That didn't make sense. But those were all the add-ons that had been built up over the years in those contracts.
They had overreached. Through years of bargaining, they had gone beyond what they could justify.
And so on Friday, February 11th, 2011, Governor Scott Walker unveiled the budget repair bill, destined to become known as Act 10.
The reality is that we have to get this current budget, the soon-to-be forthcoming budget, and budgets for decades to come in line. We can no longer kick the can to the future. That's just unacceptable.
Walker's plan meant a balanced budget with no furloughs and no layoffs. Government workers would have to start paying 12.6% of their health insurance premiums and half of their pension contributions. And at the same time, government unions would lose almost all bargaining authority. Plus, there'd be no more mandatory union membership or automatic dues deductions.
The one sticking point in every discussion was the automatic collection of dues from state employees. At the end of the day, that was the principal component or the principal item that was important to them.
And they were willing to go to war over it.
I don't think any of us would have said that we would have seen 80,000 people on the square or anything like that.
I don't think anybody realized, maybe Fitz did, but I didn't, it was how bad it got.
The first big crowd showed up on Tuesday, right when the public hearings began, which lasted for over 24 hours. From there, the bill went straight to the assembly floor, where the debate went on for days.
The challenge we have is that when the legislature's in session, we cannot close the doors. And that's the law, and we shouldn't. I mean, people have to have access and the ability to see that, what's going on. For 60 straight hours they were in, which meant that people could continue to come into the building. And during that time, they really began to kind of set up shop.
While the assembly was on the floor, 14 Democrats in the state Senate fled across the border into Illinois. That prevented a quorum in the Senate, blocking the bill from a vote indefinitely. Meanwhile, the crowds grew, and the occupation of the state capitol became more entrenched.
So that first weekend, we had tens of thousands of people show up. That was a pretty well choreographed demonstration by the unions who had contacted their people, bussed them in, and it was somewhat more of a spectacle than a demonstration.
It was, during uprisings in Egypt. They were calling Wisconsin the Egypt of, the Egypt of America. There were people carrying inflatable palm trees around the Capitol. I mean, it was a bit surreal.
Some were kind of reliving the 60s. There were certainly a number of those who were out there just enjoying the fact that, hey, we get to protest something again. There were others who were there because, well, I think they were kind of paid to be there. It's like, I'm going to go down there. This is important for my union. This is important for my benefits. And so I'm going to go out there and protest. There were others who were just militant.
I think that the noise is one thing I'll never forget.
You got to the point where the militant group really was the only thing that remained. And obviously when you have that and all they have is other militants to talk to, then it gets more militant and it gets to be more of that mob mentality that I referred to. And that's where we did not anticipate that type of militant type of reaction. I think it's easy to say that some legislators would have felt that they were under siege in that Capitol. They couldn't walk through the building without being harassed, attacked, what have you. We did have to find protective ways to bring the governor in and out.
There was another flyer saying if they're wearing a tie, they're one of them. Harass them.
The vestibule just outside was literally, had people pressed up against it and pounding on the windows.
We will hunt you down, we will slit your throats, we will drink your blood. I will have your decapitated head on a pike in the Madison Town Square. This is your last warning. Yeah, and that to Senator Kapanke on March 9th. It's that type of thing was being sent to legislators quite a bit.
To make the situation even more dangerous, most law enforcement was on the side of the protesters, and they were issuing their own threats to the governor and other Republican leaders.
The officers that I had available to me, not just the Capitol Police, but the addition, we obviously had to add officers from all over the state, but the majority of them were from Dane County and Madison City police officers in Dane County. And we had been informed by both of those leaders, the sheriff and the chief of police, that the minute we laid hands on any of the protesters in order to remove them, they would pull all their troops. Well, that was a majority of the officers we had available. So our hands were somewhat tied as far as what we could do to try to maintain order in that Capitol.
It was a Pyrrhic victory for the unions. The longer the occupation of the Capitol went on, the more Wisconsinites learned about it. And when Republican lawmakers made trips back to their districts, they found out they had a lot of support outside of Madison.
The reaction they got back home was, almost to an individual, that people were shocked that they were seeing a siege of their Capitol on CNN.
Stay strong, don't give in, you're doing the right thing. These unions are out of control.
Just the fact that the Capitol, was open solidified people, the general public, going, this is ridiculous.
When a mom or a dad has to figure out daycare at 6:30 in the morning for 8 o'clock that day, not because their son or daughter's sick, but because their school shut down so that their teachers can go protest, that's where they started. That's where I think they overplayed their hand. That's where I think you started to see public support start to move away.
I think the one thing that we consistently heard as far as the feedback was people saying, and this was kind of in March, April, said, I don't necessarily like the way Governor Walker did it, but I agree with what he has to do. You know, that we heard that constantly. They knew that this was basically their Waterloo. They either needed to succeed here and take out Governor Walker and send a clear message to anybody else that would think this way, that we have the power, and if you try to change that, it will be met with the elimination of your political career and the elimination of your political philosophy. Or, as it turned out, it vindicated and in fact strengthened that political philosophy.
Now, it had been 3 weeks, and the 14 Democrat senators were still holed up in Illinois. Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald met with a couple of them on neutral ground and immediately realized they had no exit strategy.
I was convinced that the national labor unions were never going to allow these guys to come back. So even if they chose to, they couldn't do it. And that was kind of the first time that I thought, wow, we're going to have to find a different way out of this, because it's simply not going to happen with the Democrats coming back to Wisconsin anytime soon.
It was time for the Republicans to turn to Plan B. If they stripped all the appropriations out of the budget repair bill, it would no longer be a fiscal bill, and they wouldn't need the Democrat senators to have a quorum. But they had to move fast.
You know, the old thing in the legislature is when you know you got the votes, you go.
The conference committee met on Wednesday, March 9th to introduce the amended bill. The Senate met minutes later and passed it.
There are 18 ayes, 1 no. The conference report is adopted. Senator from the 13th.
All hell broke loose. The State Patrol and Capitol Police struggled to get the Republican lawmakers to safety as new waves of protesters flooded the building. The next day it was the Assembly's turn. There was more rage, but the battle was over. Governor Walker signed the bill into law the next day, Friday, March 11th, 2011.
I wasn't going to let tens of thousands of protesters, many of whom were from other states, drown out the voices of the millions of taxpayers in this state who know we have to balance the budget. We have to do it without raising taxes so we protect the economy, and who ultimately want a government that works.
And it really did work after that. And after Act 10 became law, the state finally got its books straight. No more budget deficits. Instead, year after year, the state's surplus grew more and more enormous. What was once a $3.5 billion deficit in 2011 has been transformed into a $4 billion budget surplus in 2025. Plus, the state has slashed taxes all along the way. Local governments began reporting incredible savings as soon as they were freed from under the union's boot. For the workers, the furloughs and layoffs stopped immediately. No one lost their job. No one lost their pension. No one lost their health insurance. Even without labor contracts, there are state employees today making more than anyone would ever have thought possible before Act 10. As for the total savings, the McIver Institute estimates as of 2024, Act 10 has saved Wisconsin taxpayers and residents an equivalent of $31 billion in taxes and services since it was first enacted. The idea of going back is unthinkable for most of us. However, to this day, over 14 years later, the unions are still fighting to overturn Act 10. They will never stop. There's too much money in it for them, which is why dedicated conservatives will never be able to rest. Not as long as they want to keep taxpayers, not unions, in charge of Wisconsin's government, and for Act 10 to remain the law of the land.
That clip from the McIver Institute telling the Act 10 story. It's an act that is under threat right now from the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Though it's gone up to the court previous and have been upheld, now with a new court justice, as Julaine Appling would often say from Wisconsin Family Council, elections have consequences. Friends, a very critical Supreme Court election coming up April 1st in our state. There's one more clip we would like to share with you this evening, and this is an interview I came across just days ago between the Daily Signal, part of the Heritage Foundation, and Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Senator Johnson is one that is the chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and he's going to be doing a lot of oversight through his committee hearings. And so he sits down with the Daily Signal talking about a number of issues, like a need for the sub-cabinet post to be confirmed quickly. He's going to be talking about big pharma. He's going to be talking about the government's narrative, what it has been on COVID. He's going to be talking about DOGE and those who are trying to undo what Donald Trump is doing. And so he'll be talking about out-of-control federal spending and many other issues. Let's watch the interview between the Daily Signal and U.S. Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin.
During our days in the wilderness when we were in the minority, I'd written something like over 60 oversight letters to federal health agencies, Department of Defense, other people involved in what I referred to as our miserably failed response to COVID. The lack of transparency from the agencies, I think, has been jaw-dropping.
All right, we are very lucky to be joined today by Senator Ron Johnson. He is the chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. A senator from Wisconsin, he was first elected in 2010, and he will be leading the oversight agenda in the Senate. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So just to start with, what's ahead for Senate oversight going through 2025?
Well, I've often said I'll be like a mosquito in a nudist colony. It's a target-rich environment. I'm going to focus, obviously, on oversight investigations into government actions. During our days in the wilderness when we were in the minority, I'd written something like over 60 oversight letters to federal health agencies, Department of Defense, other people involved in what I referred to as our miserably failed response to COVID. The lack of transparency from the agencies, I think, has been jaw-dropping. And so, we're going to focus on that. I've got a pent-up demand for information that belongs to the American public, that they have every right to see. Things like the analysis of the vaccine injury surveillance systems, the empirical Bayesian analysis that when we asked for the proportional reporting ratios, they said, oh, we stopped doing those, we do EB now. So, okay, well, send us those, and they haven't. They've released some limited information through FOIA requests, but so you've had citizens gain access through the courts before members of Congress who have constitutional authority to demand this information. We haven't even gotten it. I mean, things like the last 50 pages of Anthony Fauci's emails that were heavily redacted, that we received about 4,000 pages. We narrowed our request to 400 unredacted. They wouldn't give them to us. They've allowed us into a reading room for the first 350. That took about a year's worth of effort. And now we're down to the last 50 pages after about 3 years. The redacted emails were incriminating enough. Who knows what's in those last 50 pages? So that'll be an early target of subpoenas.
With a new administration, do you think those messages and documents will be unredacted?
Absolutely. We will get those unredacted. Will we get all the information we requested? I don't know. My assumption is the shredders, the bleach bit programs and stuff are in high gear or were in high gear. Still might be. I suggested early on after President Trump's election that he ought to appoint somebody called, a Secretary of Information Extraction. The deep state does not give up its secrets easily, no matter who's in charge.
All right. Well, we did see President Joe Biden, on his way out of office, issued a marathon of pardons. You mentioned Dr. Anthony Fauci, obviously his family members and so forth, but and others. But one catch to that is that once you're pardoned, you can't plead the fifth. Do you plan on subpoenaing any of those individuals to get testimony since they no longer can invoke the fifth?
Yeah, that is a double-edged sword to the pardons. I mean, it does imply some measure of potential guilt. Otherwise, why would you do it? But no, first we have to get the documents. I mean, what you don't want to do is just call somebody in for an interview, before they have the documentation to base your questions on. You don't want to call people in for a hearing until you've probably done a transcribed interview. So there's a process to doing this. We'll have to be, somewhat patient. But again, I'm assuming the next administration will be far more transparent, far more open to providing Congress the information that, again, the American people demand.
Okay. All right. And so one aspect of the last presidency, do you think there is a space to investigate at the congressional level who was in charge during the Biden administration and what they covered up in terms of how aware he was of what was going on?
That might be a difficult one. I think we all kind of assumed that he wasn't all there, that you had members of a group of, I would call, radical leftists that have really been running government through the Obama administration and then the Biden administration. They just, they had a 4-year pause and they took right back over. We've witnessed what President Obama meant when he said the fundamental transformation of America. It's the fundamental destruction of it. And we were saved by the bell. We've got a 4-year reprieve of that destruction. We better keep winning elections. In terms of what kind of oversight, that's going to be a more difficult one. I don't know what documentation would exist, exactly how do you go about doing it. Does it really matter at this point? I mean, we saw the destruction of their governance. President Biden and or his successor did not win. Donald Trump won. So, Donald Trump was right. He said his retribution will be in the form of success. I agree with that by and large, but there are things that absolutely do need to be, loose ends need to be tied up, questions that need to be answered if we're going to move forward and reform these agencies. So, again, asking that question, I'm not sure how that's going to really help us moving forward. The American public spoke that they were very dissatisfied with Democrat governance.
Okay. All right. Now, you were among the first people in Congress to raise questions about the government's official narrative about COVID, vaccines, everything else. Also, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Senator Paul, has raised a lot of the same questions. Do you think you, as subcommittee chairman, and him as chairman, will be working pretty close together on that?
Yeah, we absolutely will. I think Rand, is really interested in the gain of function research. He's done a good job as ranking member and on the HELP committee as well. He's a doctor. I don't like duplication of efforts, so I'll let him focus on that. I certainly am interested in exactly what people like Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx, other people that I think sabotaged the last administration, did not provide the American public the informed consent they needed on the injections. I'll focus more on our miserably failed response. The sabotage of early treatment, the FDA's issuance of their tweet on ivermectin, which was completely inappropriate. This isn't horse paste. There is a version that is horse paste, but ivermectin is a Nobel Prize-winning drug. Has saved millions of people from river blindness. Unbelievably safe drug. No drug's 100% safe, but this is one very safe drug, and yet the FDA was advising against it, doing everything they could to sabotage the use of it. That could have saved literally hundreds of thousands of lives. So that needs to be investigated, and that'll probably be more my focus.
Okay. You did write a letter and during the last administration to HHS, FDA, CDC, asking that they preserve the documents. Do you know whether they did or have they provided anything? Given that
no, again, they were very opaque. Okay. They've not been cooperative. We've gotten very little information from the previous administration. I'm looking for far greater transparency out of the Trump administration. Do I believe we'll get every document? Do I believe every document was preserved? I doubt it. But they need to be very careful. For example, as my staff uncovered the email that Dr. Morin's, where he revealed that he has somebody inside FOIA advised him how to avoid providing information to Congress and to the public under FOIA requests. Again, just a corrupt act that is. But we got that because, not from the federal government, we got that because that email went to other entities. And we requested similar information from other entities that were dealing with the federal government on some of these issues, and that's where we uncovered that email out of about 115,000 pages of documents. So These investigations aren't easy. They're going to cover up what they can cover up. But it is, even if they destroy documents, particularly in the world of the internet and emails, there are other people that were in possession of those emails. So it's difficult to cover your tracks.
Right. And what's important, I mean, I keep saying we have a new administration, but we still have those deep state bureaucrats. We still have people who are going to want to cover their tracks who are still working under the Trump administration.
It's one of the reasons why we need to get his nominees confirmed quickly. The sub-cabinet posts confirmed quickly. He's done this. He's put acting administrators in place right now. He did that very, very swiftly because President Trump, in his first term, came in as he wasn't a seasoned politician. He didn't have long-standing relationships in the swamp. So he had to rely on other people advising him in terms of who the personnel was. I think he came in far more trusting of the administration, that people would respect the fact that he won the election, that he was now president, he's commander-in-chief. The permanent bureaucracy, they don't. They just look at any president, and the attitude is, this too shall pass. They're far more likely to do the bidding of a radical leftist than they are a conservative like a Donald Trump.
Right. And maybe even want to go more radical than whoever the Democratic president is.
Right.
What do you think in terms of what your committee will be investigating? What do you think Americans will be able to find out about the deep state and the politicization there that maybe they didn't know beforehand?
Well, I think what has happened during COVID is it opened up a lot of people's eyes. It certainly did mine. I used to defend Big Pharma until the pandemic, and then I really did witness firsthand how Big Pharma has captured the agencies, and that's not a one-off. I have no problem with big business. I come from the private sector, but I have a problem when big business uses the power they've accumulated to try and quash competition, try and take over the agencies that are supposed to regulate them to their advantage, disadvantage of their competitors and to the American consumer and American public. So I think we'll find that time and time again. Government represents power. It is power. And as Lord Acton aptly noted, power corrupts. And so government's corruptible. The problem is government because it will be corrupted. And these business people, they're smart. The first thing they try and do is, how can we survive in a period of overtaxation, overregulation? Well, they not only figure that out, they also figure out how to then capture the very agencies that are supposed to regulate them on behalf of the American public. And again, they turned against their competitors and the American public. So that needs to be exposed and uncovered, and it'll be uncovered, I think, in instance after instance with federal agency after federal agency.
Okay. And we did see elements of the Biden administration. He issued some orders on his way out. They've called it Trump-proof, the bureaucracy. What do you think are ways that the administration and also maybe Congress can do to undo that and ensure that?
Well, the problem with the executive order is that the next president come in and issue an executive order to just cancel it. It's more difficult with regulations that have gone through the Administrative Procedures Act. So that takes more time. We do have a power capability by the Congressional Review Act, which we will be using. I think the number is close to 150 regulatory actions that occurred in the window that we're able to overturn in time. Probably 50 of those are pretty nasty that we are certainly going to target. Those are the numbers that have been given me. I haven't seen the detail yet, but that'll be one way we can roll back some of the harm done by the Biden administration is on its way out the door.
Okay. You've been a pretty long time watcher of the taxpayers' money and how did you anticipate your committee is going to be working with DOJ in terms of looking for waste, fraud, and abuse? Yeah,
that actually be a good part of the Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee. Okay, so that'd certainly be under our jurisdiction. I'm also on the Budget Committee and the Finance Committee, so I'll be heavily engaged in any kind of budget reconciliation process. One of the things I brought one of my charts, but this one shows how out of control federal government spending was after the pandemic. I use the analogy, if you're a family and you have a major medical problem and you have to borrow $50,000 to pay for medical bills, once your family member is well, you don't keep borrowing $50,000 and keep spending at that level. You stop borrowing, you return to a pre-illness level. Well, that's what the federal government should do. In 2019, we spent $4.4 trillion. During the pandemic, we shot up, spending spree $6.6 trillion. Last 5 years, we've averaged $6.5 trillion. Last year, we spent $6.9. There's no justification for that. It's grotesque. So we have to return to some type of pre-pandemic reasonable level of spending. I've proposed a couple options. We could go back, for example, to Bill Clinton's 1998 budget. That's where we actually had a surplus. And if you take that budget and increase it based on population growth and inflation, plus you exempt Social Security, Medicare, and interest, you spend at 2025 levels there. We'd take Clinton's $1.7 trillion worth of spending, inflate that up to 5.5. What's interesting about that number is that's the revenue projection of the Biden administration. That's how feasible a balanced budget is. But if that's too reasonable for you, take Clinton or take Obama in 2014. Do the same thing, increase based on population inflation, slot in today's Medicare, Social Security, and interest. We'd be at $6.2 trillion. Right now, the one that I think that the chairman of the Budget Committee, Lindsey Graham, is focusing on is President Trump's own budget for 2025. As his last year of office, he projected in a 2021 budget what 2025 spending ought to be. We do the same thing where we use his spending plus today's Social Security, Medicare, and interest. That'd be about $6.1 trillion. So there's the range. We don't have to spend $7 trillion. It's very reasonable. Three different options of reasonableness: Clinton, Obama, or Trump. Slots us somewhere between $5.5 and $6 trillion. Now, you can take a look at those budgets. I'm presenting those to Lindsey Graham today. 200-some pages, 6,000 line items, all the detail of those budgets. Now, we need to look at that detail, adjust what we want to adjust, but there's no reason for us to be spending more than $6 trillion as a baseline budget for 2025. Now, we'll spend more than that because by the time we fund 2025, and nobody knows how we're going to do that yet, we're already halfway through the fiscal year. So 2025 is going to be a mess, and we're going to be spending it at high levels. But for 2026, if we're not down to something close to a $6 trillion baseline plus whatever inflation is for 2025 to 2026, shame on us. I will guarantee that nobody who voted for President Trump, or virtually no one who voted for President Trump, thought we would be spending at President Biden's grotesque spending levels. So I'm trying to put pressure on the process, on everybody involved. We have to get our spending down to, again, $4.4 trillion 5 years ago, somewhere in the $6 trillion range. It shouldn't be up to $7 trillion. Okay,
all right. Well, so I wanted to ask you actually about an issue in Wisconsin. We cover election integrity a lot at the Daily Signal, and there is an amendment, a constitutional amendment in April to enshrine voter ID in the Wisconsin state constitution. Do you expect that to pass?
Yes. Now, what we're going to do is that is an advisory referendum right there. So in order to have it be constitutionally binding, you have to pass it in two separate legislative sessions. But I think we'll get that one passed. I think handily, because I think we've had some other advisory referendums that passed like a 70%. So these issues that conservatives push are generally supported by large majorities of the American public.
Okay, yeah, and particularly voter ID, it's gotten high approval ratings. So.
Nationally, I think it's like 85% approval. Again, people want election integrity. They don't want an illegitimate vote or a fraudulent vote canceling out their legitimate vote. it just makes common sense.
Okay, and I want to ask the ranking member on your subcommittee is Senator Blumenthal. Do you think there might be some bipartisan opportunities there with him? Or?
Well, I think we both probably agree. I don't want to speak for him, but he's had questions about the pharmaceutical industry in the past. Mm-hmm. I think he's asked questions about whether pharmaceutical companies should, advertise. We're one of, I think, only 2 nations that allows that. Mm-hmm. Now, we'd probably come at it from 2 different viewpoints. I think he would want to eliminate pharmaceutical advertising because he thinks it'll bring the cost of drugs down. I don't think it's that big an issue in terms of the price of drugs. I want to ban it because it allows them to control the narrative. And that was revealed during COVID. If you look at a pharmaceutical ad where they've got 30 seconds of all the horrible side effects, first of all, you would never spend money to run an ad warning consumers how your product might kill them. Okay, so it makes no sense. Nobody knows what those drugs are. You can see some happy people throwing a frisbee to a dog, or running on the beach or grilling out. So the only reason they spend billions of dollars advertising on media is so they can capture the narrative. And we saw that they were able to do that very successfully during COVID. We can't allow that.
Okay, all right. I think that's everything I have. Is there anything you would want to add or any issues to cover?
Well, going back to our budget, one of the things I've recommended is, and I know President Trump and the House want one big, beautiful bill. That's going to be hard to achieve. It just is. I mean, practically speaking, let's face it, we when President Trump first won, repeal, replace Obamacare, everybody talked about it. We were completely unprepared for it, and nobody had a good plan, and that utterly failed. So from my standpoint, I'd like to do 3-step reconciliation. The first one, let's give President Trump the funds he needs to secure the border over 4 years. I mean, that's, in Republican circles, completely non-controversial. That ought to pass easily. When we do that, we must establish the budget based on current policy for revenue. That's exactly how we handle spending bills. If a spending program ends and they want to extend it in the budget, it doesn't score. They just assume it's going to be extended, so it scores nothing. If a tax provision that returns more of the money to the American public ends, and you want to extend it, that's a big score. So that's ridiculous. So, we pass a budget based on current policy. That will allow us then, in the second very quick reconciliation, just extend current policy, tax policy. That will take a massive tax increase that's going to occur automatically off the table, giving us time to thoughtfully work on hopefully simplifying and rationalizing the tax code. President Trump has a number of tax proposals. We do have expired provisions of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, generally having to do with the business depreciation, amortization, R&D, that type of thing. I'd like to throw all that stuff in the hopper with the mind toward how do we make our tax system a lot simpler, a lot more rational. It costs $400 billion plus to comply with our tax code. Let's eliminate that cost to our economy. So that will take time. We can't rush that process. In that final bill is then when we will use all the reconciliation as well to achieve a reasonable baseline budget for 2026 and beyond. So again, that's going to take a lot of work. It's going to be complex. Let's return certainty, no tax increase in 2026, and let's make sure that President Trump has the funds he needs to honor his promise to the American public about securing the border.
And do you think real spending cuts are achievable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, it's and again, I'm not approaching it from a grotesquely unreasonable $7 trillion base. I'm saying, again, I don't think Bill Clinton spent too little.
Right.
Okay. I think that budget passed 85-15. So there are plenty of Republicans that voted for Bill Clinton's 1998 spending priorities. Again, I'm not suggesting $1.7 trillion of spending. I'm saying 5.5 because I'm inflating it for population growth and inflation, and using today's Social Security, Medicare, and interest expense. It's incredibly reasonable. Nobody can argue against that approach. They just can't. They can, pick and choose. Well, we're not spending enough here, or we're spending too much. Fine. We need to go through that detail, which is why I printed out more than 200 pages with 6,000 individual line item spending deals. Let's go through that with a fine-tooth comb.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
U.S. Senator Ron Johnson being interviewed by Fred Lucas of the Daily Signal about a number of important issues that don't only impact our state, but impact our nation as a whole as well. We want to thank you for watching TV30's inFocus program. A reminder, Lord willing, next Monday night, live from our new studios and a new set, and looking forward to Daniel Degner. We have much to talk about on our plate. But in the meantime, friends, we encourage you to be in prayer for our nation. Our nation is so in need of prayer. There is a need of revival across our land. The problems are not political, they are spiritual. It begins in the heart of man. So thank you for watching WVCY Channel 30's inFocus program as we keep you informed on these critical issues each and every week. Good night. May God bless you.